Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here. Happy Tuesday. Happy week 10, I think, unbelievably. Um, that's who's here. So Aliana's here. Good morning, Aliana. Casey's here. Good morning again, Casey. Carmen's here. Good morning, Carmen. Good morning, Cindy. Good morning, Jenna. Good morning, Min. Let's see who else is here. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Again. Lily's here. Good morning, Lily. Good morning, Lim. Caleb's here. Good morning, Caleb. Good morning, Ying. Mashid is here. Good morning, Mashid. Pearly's here. Hello, Pearly. Good morning. Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Shaffan's here too. Good morning to you. So as people trickle in here, although I think we've got a bunch of people, but as more people trickle in, what we'll do today is we will look at, we'll review what we talked about yesterday as kind of an introduction to ancient Greece, some of our time periods, some of our early civilizations. We will talk a little bit about these hoplites and the hoplite phalanx, which you just read about. And then we'll look at Greek religion, and that will kind of set us up for what we'll do tomorrow, which is exploring Athens and Athenian democracy and kind of some of the things that happen in classical Greece. And again, classical Greece is kind of the ancient Greece that most people think of in their head when they imagine ancient Greece. And so that's kind of the period we'll focus the most on. And so we'll look a little bit at religion. Later on, we'll look at philosophy, I think, and a little bit of art and architecture, maybe. Most of it will pertain to that classic period, but that's kind of where we'll go in the next few days. Adalbert's here. Good morning, Adalbert. Hello, Ella, and hello again, Tika. Okay, so let's dive in, okay? So yesterday we were looking at ancient Greece. We started talking about ancient Greece, and we said that the Greece of the ancient world was a little bit different than the Greece of the modern world, right? So the Greece of the modern world is really just that kind of main section there. So it includes Crete, it includes a bunch of islands, and modern Greece is kind of that blue and gray and kind of yellow area. That's really what Greece is today for the most part. But in the past, in the ancient world, there were Greek city-states scattered all around the Aegean, so all through what is now Greece, but also kind of along the shore of what's now Eastern Europe and along the western shore of what's now Turkey. And so all of that was the Greek world. And so the Greeks had a lot of contacts with each other across the Aegean because they were sailors and traders. And so people would kind of sail their boats all the way along the coast, fishing and trading and things like that. And so again, the Greek world in the past was kind of a, not just regular Greece, but the area around the Aegean was Greek influenced. We said that Greece itself was particular and a little bit peculiar, I think, because it's a very rocky, mountainous place. It's not very good for farming. It's not very good for agriculture. And so this is really the first civilization that we've seen that has appeared in a place that wasn't a river valley, that wasn't a river floodplain where people practiced intensive agriculture and grew crops. This is a different kind of civilization that appears. And so it's kind of odd that way. So the physical geography of Greece was one that wasn't very good for agriculture. It was very rocky and mountainous. But that also kind of ensured that Greek city-states, or Greek polis as they're called, it also made sure that they stayed independent. And so for most of its ancient history, well, for parts of its ancient history, Greece isn't actually unified. It's just a collection of city-states, a collection of polis that sometimes unite together against a common enemy like the Persians, and sometimes are not united and are kind of fighting amongst themselves. But there's no Greece remains a very difficult place to conquer because it's so mountainous and because you can't just march your army across it and take over everything. Um, and so Greeks, Greece's topography or Greece's physical geography was important in terms of the independence of its city-states, but also the fact that it wasn't really an agricultural state. It was one that was focused on herding and fishing and growing of olive trees that we talked about as well. Um, yeah, we said that. Okay. We also said that one of the things that came out of Italy was a lot of ceramics, and so they used ceramics to, to eat off of and to drink from, but also to store things as well. Lots of food and olive oil, in particular, was stored in pots that were made from clay, and the clay around Athens in Attica and the clay around Corinth turned out to be particularly useful for ceramics, and so both of those areas became very skilled at creating pottery, and so we see really beautiful examples of pots from ancient Greece, even though they're considered works of art today, and you would see this in a museum somewhere like the Louvre or the British Museum or wherever. Even though these things are kind of priceless artifacts today, at the time they really wouldn't have been. They would have been just the pot that the olive oil came in that you bought, and so the pot really wasn't the thing. It was the olive oil inside that you were paying for. But nonetheless, the pottery was quite beautiful. It took a lot of skill to create pots like this. And the other kind of nice thing about pottery is that from an archaeological perspective, it will preserve for a very long time. Many other things like metal will rust away. Sometimes bones will disappear in the soil if it's very acidic. Anything made of wood will decompose. Many things will not survive in the ground to be found later by archaeologists. But pottery and ceramics, when they are properly fired, are basically indestructible, and they will last almost forever. And so there's huge amounts of ceramics that have been found in Greece from ancient times. And part of the reason is that they used a lot of ceramics, they used a lot of pottery, but part of the reason is also the fact that ceramics are very durable and they don't disintegrate in the ground. But yeah, some of them are quite beautiful, as you can see here. We said for resources, the ancient Greeks didn't have a lot in terms of metals, but there was a particularly popular silver mine that we'll talk about a little bit later. We said there's a few major periods of Greek civilization here. We talked a little bit yesterday about the Minoan and the Mycenaean. Both of these are Bronze Age civilizations in Greece, and they kind of predate the sort of classical Greek civilization that we often think of. And so they're separated from that later period by a dark age. So we said yesterday that during the Bronze Age, there were two civilizations, a Minoan and a Mycenaean civilization. We don't know a huge amount about these two societies, particularly the Minoans, because we cannot read their writing. But again, so the Minoan civilization was on Crete, like I mentioned. We know them from these the ruins of these palaces that are left behind, particularly in Knossos on Crete. This is kind of what it looks like now. Parts of it have been rebuilt for tourists and so on. But in the past, it probably would have looked something like this. The Minoans had a written script called Linear A. We don't know how to read this, so we have no idea what this says. But one of the things we do have from the Minoans is artwork. And so there are lots of frescoes that have been preserved on the walls. So that's where you put plaster on the wall and then you paint on top of the plaster. And so here you see two young boys kind of having a little boxing match here. You see men and women dressed up really fancy for some sort of ritual or festival or party. Here you see some nature scenes, like some monkeys that look very fun, some dolphins and some fish, which is very decorative. And then we often see a lot of bulls on Crete as well. And so the bull seems to have had some kind of significance for the Minoans. We're not really sure exactly what, because again, we can't read their writing. But the bull seems to have been important. And here we see some sort of crazy sport in which you jump over a charging bull. It seems like that's what we're looking at anyway. That seems completely insane to me, but the Minoans seem to have been entertained by it, maybe. It's hard to know. Yeah, so very remarkable sort of bull sculpture here. And of course, a little bit later on in Greek history, we'll have the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. And so the Minotaur is kind of a half bull, half man kind of monster that lives on Crete in a labyrinth, in a maze. And in the myth, Theseus goes and kills the Minotaur. Spoiler. The Mycenaeans lived on the mainland, and the Mycenaeans we know again from these large cities, walled cities and palaces that exist. As you can see, there are really big stone blocks lifted into place to build these cities, which is quite remarkable. And even the Greeks who came later were very impressed by this building technology. They thought that cities like Mycenae must have been built by giants because of the size of the stones that they used. Yeah, so you can see a few artist reconstructions of what Mycenae would have looked like thousands of years ago. Pretty impressive city, right? Pretty impressive city with a central palace, as you can see there. And again, the Mycenaeans had a writing style too, Linear B, which I believe we can read. Yeah, and the other thing we see is that the Mycenaeans were buried with a lot of gold and with a lot of weaponry, and often with these sort of gold death masks. And so here's the death mask. It's called the Mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the famous king in the Iliad. So he's a character that goes to Troy and fights in the Trojan War. This is almost certainly not his mask, but that's what it was called at the time, and the name sort of stuck. So it's the death mask of Agamemnon, even though we don't know who it belonged to, and it probably wasn't Agamemnon. Right, so after this sort of Minoan period, there's a Mycenaean period. The Mycenaeans seem to have conquered the Minoans or taken over the Minoan civilization at some point. But then around 1100 BCE, so around 3,000 years ago or so, we see a collapse in centralized organization, economic and political organization. So people seem to abandon the Mycenaean cities. People seem to abandon the palaces. They kind of go off into the hills and live on their own. People stop writing things down, and they kind of the writing systems of Linear A and Linear B are kind of forgotten about. And so we have this kind of 400-year period where it's a dark age, and it's a dark age because there seems to be no centralized political or economic organization, but it's also a dark age because nothing's written down. And so archaeologists and historians are kind of in the dark about what exactly was going on during this period. But again, around 700 BCE, so around 2,700 years ago, we see people starting to organize themselves into cities again. And so the first polis, the first polises tend to start to appear. We see Greeks starting to leave Greece and set up city-states in other parts of the Aegean, so in Asia Minor, what's now Turkey. And then we see people starting to create a writing system as well. And so this is kind of the ancient Greek writing system is created around this period, around 700 BCE. And so there's a few things here that happen. We start to see the very beginnings of Greek culture. So we have this idea of pan-Hellenism, this idea that the Greeks, no matter where they are, no matter what polis they live in, whether they live in Greece or whether they live in Asia Minor somewhere, they have this feeling of being united by a common culture. So they have kind of a common religious views. They have common stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are stories that are told throughout the Greek world and are finally written down in the 700s, although people were probably telling them for quite a long time before that. And then we see the first Olympic Games in 776 BC. And so, again, that's originally it was part of a festival to honor Zeus, kind of the main Greek god. Part of a festival to honor him, but again, people from anywhere in the Greek world could come and compete, right? And they could win honor, they could win glory at the Olympic Games. So again, because people start writing things down, we start to see this evidence of Greek culture, the Greek culture that we know later, kind of just starting to appear, starting to form. Yeah. So we talked yesterday about the polis, and you told me that this was kind of a basic political and economic organization within Greece. So Greece wasn't the kingdom of Greece, it wasn't the empire of Greece. Greece was just a bunch of little independent city-states. And so each city-state was a little city with a wall around it. It kind of controlled and protected the farmland that surrounded it. And each one had its own kind of unique character, unique political organization, unique economic organization. And there were lots of them. There was up to about 1,500 of these little city-states scattered around the Aegean. And again, all of them were a little bit different, right? They all had their unique way of doing things, their unique style of government, their unique, not unique set of gods, but they all would have an individual god that would protect the city. But again, most of the city-states were quite small, with just a few thousand people living in the city. So city-states like Athens and Sparta, even though they were quite small, had a pretty significant effect on history as a whole, which is pretty amazing. We said yesterday that these polis were organized in several different ways, and there were kind of three broad political systems in use, right? We said one was a monarchy, in which we have kind of an individual ruler who is in control of the city-state. We said there was oligarchy, where you have a small group of individuals who are in charge of running the city-state. And then we had democracy, where people have the power, okay? And so this was a reasonably new idea at this time. I know that we're very used to democracy nowadays because many countries have chosen some version of democracy to run their state. But at the time, it was a very new idea and untested. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so I asked you some questions. So tell me, good people, what is a hoplite? What's a hoplite phalanx? It's probably the strangest term you've ever heard in your life, but what is a hoplite phalanx? Okay, let's see here. So Karen says it's a form of fighting. Okay, that's partially true. That's partially true. Aliana says it's a new way of fighting. Okay, that spreads throughout the Greek world. That is true. Casey says a new way of fighting that spreads around the Greek world and coincides with the rise of another institution, which is the polis. That's true. So the appearance of the polis and the appearance of the hoplite phalanx seem to go together. We're not sure if one comes before the other, but they appear kind of at the same time. New way of fighting. Okay. Good. Let me give you just a little more here. So this is what a hoplite looks like. And so a hoplite is a soldier. Okay, so it's a Greek word for a soldier. And hoplites were armed with, that's very true as well, Pearly. Yeah, a new way of fighting that requires people to work together as a whole. Yep. So this is a, these are two hoplites. And so as you can see, they have some very basic equipment. They have a round shield. They have a long kind of spear or a pike. And then in many cases, they have a really short sword as well. The hoplites who were richer, a little bit, oh, and they have a helmet too. The hoplites who were a little bit richer could afford greaves, which are those kind of shin guards that you see the guy on the left wearing. And then a little bit later on, you see these fancier helmets as well. And so this is kind of a typical Spartan helmet that you see on the guy on the left. But both of these are hoplites. They are Greek soldiers that have some very basic equipment, and they provide this equipment themselves, right? So they have to pay for their own shield and helmet and spear and sort of short sword that they have. They have to pay for all of that stuff. So the hoplites are these soldiers that are sort of private citizens that live in the city-state, that live in the polis, and they have to provide their own equipment so that if their city-state should be attacked, or if they're going to attack another polis, that they can arm themselves. This is kind of what the phalanx looks like. And so you've got a big collection of Greek hoplites, of Greek warriors. They've all got their shields and their spears, and you can see all these people have little shin guards on there. Those are greaves, and this is how they're going to attack their enemy. And so what they're going to do is they're all going to cluster together. They're all going to hold their shields in their left hand. And so that's going to help cover them and the person next to them. Okay? And so you can see here with lots of really long spears, it's going to be very difficult for you to get anywhere close to their army, right? They're like a giant porcupine. And basically what they would try to do is charge into the opposing army and basically try to push them over and get them to break up. Okay, and so once their phalanx breaks up, once they start to scatter, then these guys can pull out their little sword there, like you can see on the guy on the right. They can pull out their sword and start cutting people up, right? But if you don't want to be cut up, if you don't want to be stabbed with a sword by the opposing army, then you don't break your formation, right? You stay in this tight formation and you cooperate with everyone else on the battlefield, right? So that's what a hoplite phalanx is. A hoplite is a soldier, and the soldiers kind of looked roughly like this, and the phalanx was their sort of battle organization, and they would all cluster together in this way so that their shields protected themselves and the guy next to them, and they would have these really long spears that they would use. And so, you know, if you were an army charging into them, it would be pretty difficult to get at them. But again, once one once an army's phalanx started to break up, then people would use swords and sort of stab the enemy. Okay. What about this? How could the phalanx be seen as a microcosm, that's a fancy word, of the polis? So a microcosm is kind of like a mini version, right? A smaller version of something that's larger. So Cindy here says, the survival of the polis depended on the dedication of its citizens to the collective well-being of the city-state. This dedication included service in the phalanx. Yeah, they illustrate the key values on a small scale. Aliana says, historians do not know which came into existence first. That's right. But they have a similar ideology. And I think that's the ideology there. So, okay, we got a few things. So, citizenship in Greek city-states was connected to military service, right? So the idea here is that if you are not willing or able to defend your city-state, you don't get a say in how it is run. Okay, so that was part of it, right? If you want to say in governance of the city-state, you have to be willing to pick up weapons and defend your city-state. But I think this is probably the best, the main part of the answer here that Cindy has is that for the city-state, for the polis to exist and for it to continue to operate, everybody had to kind of work together and to ensure that people could, to ensure everything continued to operate, and if it was attacked, that it would be defended, right? So if you are living in, Corinth, for instance, if you live in the polis of Corinth, there's no greater king or empire that's going to defend you. There's no kind of official army of Greece that's going to look after you. If Corinth is attacked, the only way that Corinth is going to be defended is if everybody picks up a sword and a shield and goes off to battle, right? So these city-states, these polis, were very much on their own. And so if your city-state was going to flourish and continue to run, everybody had to contribute. And that also applied to military matters. And so again, if somebody was attacking your city-state, you had to be willing to pick up your sword and your shield and your spear and go off to defend your polis, right? Good, that's good. All right. Major Greek gods. There's quite a few. There's quite a few Greek gods. There are, there's quite a number of Greek gods, but there's a handful of them that are kind of the most important. They show up in most of the myths of the Greeks, and they kind of attract the most worship or the most attention. So let's see. Okay, so Aliana has Zeus. Zeus's wife Hera, yeah. Poseidon, good. Hermes, good. Athena, Ares, Dionysus, Apollo, and Artemis. Good. We got the same ones there. Cindy's got a little more here. So Zeus is kind of the king of the gods, right? He's the god of the sky and of thunder. We have Poseidon, who's the god of the sea. We have Hermes, who is a messenger god. We have Athena, who's the goddess of wisdom and of war, which is an interesting combo, but that's what she is. We have Ares, who's the god of war. We have Dionysus, who's kind of the god of wine and partying and, kind of behaving badly. We have Apollo, who's the god of the sun, and Artemis, who's the god of the moon. Good. Got all those. Yeah, Zeus is kind of seen as the the leader of the gods, right? He's kind of the father figure in this family of gods. Yeah, we have Hades, which I think we missed. Yeah, so Hades is the god of the underworld. Um, Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. So I'm not sure if Persephone is a god or if she is just a child of a god. I forget. Karen, I forget if Persephone is a. I forget if Persephone is a god or not. But she shows up in myth for sure. Hera's okay, good. We've covered those. Good. So the interesting thing, and we'll get back to this, we don't have to remember it now, but the interesting thing is that all of these gods will show up in Rome as well. That's true. That's true, Karen. He's the wife of, or Persephone becomes the wife of Hades after Hades, I think, kind of kidnaps her. But we may get to that one. But you're very right. But I can't remember who Persephone's father is. That's the thing I don't know. So yeah, we have all these gods, and the Romans will borrow these gods later and rename them. And so Zeus will become Jupiter. Poseidon will become oh shoot, what's his name? I can't remember. Darn it. Hermes will become Mercury. Ares will become Mars. Hades will become Pluto. And so the Hera will become Hestia. And so the Romans will kind of take these gods and rename them later. And of course, some of those probably sounded familiar because we've used those names to name planets, right? So Jupiter, Mars, Pluto are all Roman gods that were borrowed or plagiarized, if you will, from ancient Greece. Okay, and so the last thing we'll deal with here really quickly is cults and oracles. And we've had oracles come up already just in our last unit when we were talking about China, right? And this might be interesting because I don't know that the textbook did a great job of explaining what these two things were, but let's see what we have. So cults drew visitors from all over the Greek world, okay. And oracles spoke responses to questions asked by inquirers through a priestess named Pythia. Yes, but not always. So there were different oracles you could go to. But hang on, let's keep going here. Cindy says the oracle spoke responses to questions asked by inquirers. Good. Okay. I'm just going to switch back to here. So there's our hoplite phalanx. So yeah, our Greek, they did attract visitors from all over the Greek world. That's true. So here's our Greek gods. Oops, okay, hang on. Maybe I jumped ahead too quickly. City-states and major rulers considered it essential to consult the oracle before embarking on any major endeavor. Okay, good stuff. So our major Greek gods, like we mentioned, are here. So we've got Zeus, who's kind of the head, the king of the gods, if you will. The god of weather. He's associated with thunder and thunderbolts. He cheats on his wife quite a bit, so he's kind of he's a questionable moral character, but he is still the sort of head of the gods, right? His wife is Hera. She's kind of the goddess of childbirth, but also of the home, I think, of kind of women at home. She's often very jealous of other women around Zeus, and she probably should be because he cheats on her quite a bit. We have Poseidon, the god of the sea. We have Hermes, the messenger god. We have Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. We have war and wisdom. We have Ares, the god of war. Dionysus of wine. Apollo, the god of the sun. But also a healer, right? Apollo has kind of a medicinal or healing function to him as well. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and of the moon. And again, these gods are worshipped throughout the Greek world. So this is what I wanted to share with you here, because the textbook doesn't really do a great job of explaining these things at the moment. So a cult is this. It is kind of the cult comes from the word care. It's the care that are owned to particular gods or particular temples. And so people who belong to a cult, at least in the ancient world, I know we have a negative impression of cults nowadays, but in the past, cults were just a group of people who had special religious knowledge that was related to a particular god. Okay, so the cult of, Hestia, for instance, they would have a bunch of special secret rituals and prayers that they would use to pray to Hestia. And if you needed Hestia's help, you might go to the shrine, and the cult of Hestia would help you to pray to her or ask her for something. Okay, so again, in the modern world, cult has kind of a negative perception around it. In the past, it wasn't that at all. It was just kind of a group of religious practitioners who worshipped a particular god. And oracles, I think the text did a better job with this. An oracle, again, is a person or an agency who can provide insightful and sometimes prophetic prophecies, predictions, or some sort of information about the future. And so it's divination, it's fortune telling. And so, like you've mentioned here, the oracles attracted people from around the Greek world. And often rulers would consult an oracle when they wanted an answer to a question, right? Should we attack Athens? And so you might go to the oracle and ask if Apollo thinks that you should attack Athens. And in theory, Apollo the god, would speak through the oracle and give you an answer to your question. In theory, anyway. So that's what cults and oracles were. So we see, of course, that the ancient Greeks are polytheistic, just like we talked about before. And so, like the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, and like Hinduism, there are many gods, right? There are multiple gods in this kind of cosmology. People sort of respect all of the gods, but sometimes they talk to certain gods depending on what they want or what they need. And every kind of city-state, every polis, has its own patron god that looks after the city-state. There are cults, right? So there are special groups of priests or religious practitioners that maintain a shrine to Apollo or to Ares or whatever, and so they sort of worship specifically that god. And there's also oracles, and so if you need an answer to a question, and you want to ask the gods, you go to the oracle and ask that question. And so one of the most important oracles is the oracle at Delphi, which is an oracle of Apollo. And so if you wanted to ask Apollo a question, you would go to Delphi, you would go to the oracle and ask your question, and the oracle would give you an answer. Often the answer was kind of cryptic and difficult to interpret, but you would have your answer from the god. Okay, so we've been working really hard. Let's take a little break, stretch your legs, get something to drink, come back in 10 minutes, and we will dig a little deeper into Greek religion and kind of what the gods were like. Okay, but take a break, and I'll see you back here very shortly, okay? Okay, and we're back. So, where do we leave off? I'm going to jump us back a couple. Yeah, so we have a collection of Greek gods here. There are more than this, but these are kind of the major ones, right? Zeus and Hera, and Poseidon and Hermes, and Athena and Ares and Dionysus, Apollo, Artemis, and I've got Hades is missing from my list too, but he should definitely be there, the god of the underworld. Um, and again, all Greeks would have known about these gods and probably worshipped them at various times, but people had their favorites depending on the city that they lived in, but also what you wanted to ask for. And so if you needed help with something, or if you were required to honor the gods in certain ways, then you would sacrifice to them and sort of offer them your respect, right? And so we said cults were specific groups of people that were dedicated to the worship of one particular deity or one particular god. And they would do their work at temples or shrines or such things, right? And so in some cases you would go to an oracle if you wanted to ask a particular question of the god. You would be able to go there, and the oracle would be able to connect with the divine. They would be able to connect with the god and give you an answer to your question. Okay, so I want to explore Greek religion a little bit more, and Greek myth a little bit more. And in the process, I just wanted to remind you of this slide here, which we have seen before. And it was just a quick definition of what a myth is. And we said that myths are stories that are passed down from generation to generation. We said that myths usually contain some aspect of the fantastic or the supernatural, or some sort of part of the story that is outside of regular reality. And generally these myths contain a story, or not a story. They contain a lesson or a moral, right? Some lesson that we're supposed to learn. That's usually what myths are. And so what I want to do now is I want to watch this short video. And the video talks a little bit about Greek gods and how the Greeks interacted with them. It tells us a little bit about what the gods were like in terms of their character. It talks a little bit about how we know what we know about Greek myth and Greek religion. The video talks about certain myths that the Greeks believed in and what kind of lessons or understandings they were able to take from those myths. The video kind of turns that question around and explains what we can learn about the garbage trucks, all garbage trucks. It explains what these kind of myths can help us learn about the Greeks themselves. And the video also talks about two other important things. This number 7 is a very important one. Number 6 is the Euthyro dilemma. Okay, so the Euthyro dilemma and hubris. So I would like you to have a look at this video. It's about 10 minutes long or so. I've posted the video link and the questions in Microsoft Teams. So I'll give you about 12 or 13 minutes to watch the video and to type out some answers for me. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about what we've learned and what those things mean. Okay, so go to Microsoft Teams. You'll find the video link and the questions there, and then I'll see you back here. I'll see you back here in about 13 minutes. Okay. Okay, people, and we're back. So, hope you enjoyed the video. As you saw, of course, there are lots of Greek gods, and actually they mentioned a few that we forgot to mention, like Aphrodite and Hephaestus, right? So those are two pretty important gods in the sort of pantheon of important gods that the Greeks refer to pretty often. And so, what were these gods like in terms of their character? What were they like? What were they like, these gods? Okay, so Karen says they had human flaws. Okay. Casey says they're just like regular humans who drink and gamble and meddle with humans and are not perfect, and they make mistakes, right? Aliana says, yeah, they make mistakes. They're selfish. They gamble. They're unfair to the humans who worship them. I think I mentioned earlier that Zeus cheated on his wife all the time, and so Zeus has a lot of children throughout Greek myth because he's always sleeping with other women. It's interesting because the Greek gods are not perfect, virtuous beings, right? They are very flawed and fallible, and they sort of do silly things sometimes, and they get angry and jealous and insecure and all kinds of things that are human qualities, right? And in many cases we see that, the gods within a religion are seen as, again, perfect, virtuous, beings that are sort of all good or all bad. But here, in terms of the Greeks, we have gods that are very humanistic, right? Yes, they are very powerful. They're, these supreme beings, but they also act kind of like humans do and behave badly sometimes. Yeah, kind of different, right? So, where does our knowledge of Greek religion and myth come from? Where does that come from? Oops. So Cindy says, the myths were told around fires and in the public square by parents and children and priests. Yes. So for a long time, Greek religion and Greek myth would have been passed down orally, right? So people would have told stories, they would have gone to temples, they would have heard the stories, and they passed them down by word of mouth. And so many of these stories wouldn't have been written down prior to kind of archaic Greece. And so some of these stories of, Zeus or Hades or Poseidon or Persephone, like we heard about, many of those would have been passed down orally, and so they wouldn't have been written for quite some time. Aliana says, yeah, they were passed on for generations by storytelling. Yeah, very true. Until eventually, yeah, they're written down, right? And so as we see written language being developed again at the beginning of archaic Greece, we see people start to write things down, and one of the things they write down are these sort of classic epic stories, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey. And so so these epic works by Homer and Hesiod probably have been around for quite some time before they're written down. It's probably likely that Homer and Hesiod didn't create these stories. They were just the ones that wrote them. And within these stories, we see, we start to learn a lot about how the Greeks see the world, what the Greek gods are, what the gods are like. how people think about the gods and respond to the gods, what Greek values are, right? What things do the Greeks think are good or bad, or what is good behavior and what is bad behavior? All of those come out of these very early works of Greek literature, and they're big. If you look at the Iliad, it's like this thick. The Odyssey is this thick. So there's lots of stuff to look at, right? There's lots of information that we gain from those, but thankfully they were written down, right? And thankfully we can read that language, because without it, we would have no idea, right? We'd have no idea about any of this stuff. What kind of things do these myths help the Greeks understand? So we said that myths often have a lesson or a moral or something we're supposed to learn from them. What did the Greeks learn from their myths? So Aliana says something, okay, it helps them understand nature and morality. Good. Cindy says they help alter the way that a culture sees or understands their world. Yeah, so the nature thing was the story of Demeter and Hades and Persephone, right? And so the fact that Persephone spends half of the year in the underworld with Hades means that her mother, Demeter, is sad without her. And when her mother is sad, the crops don't grow, like in the winter, right? So it helped the Greeks understand the cycle of seasons. The reason why the crops don't grow in the winter, well, it's because Demeter is sad, because Persephone has been taken to the underworld, right? Right, so we hear about that. We hear about moral ideas of right or wrong, where they came from, and where the Greeks come from, and where how a city was founded. I think they mentioned that in the text, the idea that the people of Thebes came from dragon's teeth, right? The dragon's teeth were thrown into the soil and people popped out, and that's where the first people living in Thebes came from. There's an origin myth there. Ooh, you guys have a lot to say here. Okay, hang on. Where was I? Yeah, helps to understand the nature and the natural world. Yep, that's good. Events in the environment and how one should act. Good. Nature and morality and history. And Pearlie says they craved stories as well. Yeah, so every culture has stories. Every culture has myths, right? And the Greeks are no different in this regard. And I think it's interesting to imagine what kind of stories might have existed in the cultures and civilizations that we have no written record of. Because again, just because nothing was written down doesn't mean there weren't stories. There absolutely were, but just don't know what they were. Lim says, ideas of right and wrong, like King Midas. Yeah, so Midas is obsessed with gold and riches, and so he makes a wish so that everything he touches would turn to gold. And so he's given this power. Everything he touches turns into gold, which of course is a lot of fun at first, but then he realizes that he can't eat any of his favorite food because all the food he touches turns to gold. He finds that he can't, touch his family anymore. He can't, hug his wife or his children because they'll turn to gold as well. And so his greed for wealth actually acts as a barrier to him being able to enjoy the things that he loves, right? His family and food and all kinds of things, right? That's a good one. Yeah, they understand about the nature and the world. That's good. Adalbert says they're used to teach people about events like they could not always understand, like illness and death. Yeah. So what happens when people die? Well, in Greek myth or Greek religion, you enter the underworld, right? You go and see Hades and see if you're going to stay with Hades or if you're going to enter some sort of paradise. Lim says, oh yeah, sorry, this is the other. Sorry, Lim, I didn't realize that you had the other half of the Midas myth. So yeah, he found out that he couldn't eat or touch the people he loved, and so yeah, wealth is not the most important thing. It can actually keep you from being able to enjoy the things that are most important, right? Yeah, so it helped the Greeks understand where they came from, gave them a sense of history, lessons about the world and about love, yes. You can't circumvent the gods, Karen. You can't outsmart them with your steel gloves. It doesn't work that way. Nice try, though. What do these myths help us understand about the Greeks? What do we learn about the Greeks from their myths? So they learned things about morality and history and the nature of their world and what correct behavior was. Yeah, we saw that they too craved stories, right? Just like we like to sit down and watch Netflix or something. The Greeks too liked their stories, and we see that within those stories there are some pretty interesting and sophisticated ideas, right? Yeah. We get some sense of their morality, right? What kind of things they felt were good and bad and right or wrong. Casey, look at you guys. You got tons of stuff. The Greeks were also like us in that they craved entertainment and stories. Yeah. The only difference is that their stories were told in person. Yeah. And the gods were capable of doing good and bad things. We see also that family is important to them. Yes. And they liked parties and to be entertained. Sure. Absolutely. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of reading the stories like these is seeing how, even though these people lived thousands of years ago, how similar they were to us, right? How similar in terms of they wanted entertainment, they wanted stories that were meaningful, they wanted stories that had emotional content, and it's all there, right? You can see kind of how human these people actually are. Okay, so the Euthyphro dilemma comes up. It's something to do with Socrates, right? And Aliana says, yeah, it's to do with Socrates. Socrates is one of these thinkers that comes out of the ancient world, and he's similar to the Buddha, who of course we've talked about, and similar to Confucius, who of course we've talked about, in that all three of these guys are trying to understand how the world works and what our place in the world is, but they're trying to do it without looking to the gods. They're trying to sort of figure things out in a moral, philosophical, humanistic way. Okay, and again, that's not very common at this point in history. It's kind of a strange thing to do. So what's this Euthyphro dilemma that Socrates proposes? What's he trying to figure out? What's he trying to figure out? Tough one? Euthyphro dilemma. A dilemma is like a problem. It's like a question that you don't have the answer to. Karen says, right. So, what Socrates is trying to, darn dog. What Socrates is trying to figure out here is, how do we know if something is good or not, right? How do we know that an action is a good thing, right? And so he asks, is something good because the gods do it or say to do it? Or do the gods say to do it because it is good, right? How do we know what things are good? Does goodness, do the gods decide what's good? And if they don't decide what's good, how do they know, right? And so Socrates is kind of attempting to figure this out from a moral, philosophical perspective, right? He's not simply believing the gods and saying, well, the gods say it, so it must be good, the end. He's saying, why are the gods saying this? Are we saying that just because the gods say something that it's good, or do the gods only say things that are good? And if so, how do we know what things are good? What's the standard? Yeah. Pearlie says, are things okay just because the gods do them, or is there another standard? Yeah. And that's a very philosophical question to ask. And again, it's one that in some ways challenges the gods and what they stand for, which is very interesting in this point in history. Okay, last one. We've only got a few more minutes. This is an easy one, though. What is hubris? What is hubris? This is kind of an important one because the idea of hubris is one that is taught over and over again in many Greek myths. We see this concept being kind of driven into the Greeks all the time. So Cindy says, punishment by the god in horrible ways. Yes, if you commit hubris, or if you are guilty of hubris, yes, you will be punished by the gods in horrible ways. Cindy says the world didn't revolve around them. The forces in the world they couldn't control. Okay, not quite, but sort of. This is it here. Excessive pride, arrogance, or defiance of the gods. And Lim says it here too. When a mortal becomes too proud or too confident or think themselves at the same level as the gods, that's hubris, right? When you think you're better than everyone else, and particularly when you think you're better than the gods. If you are living in ancient Greece, big mistake. People who commit hubris and think that they are better than the gods, smarter than the gods, more beautiful than the gods. In Greek myths, all of those people suffer horrible punishments. And so the Greeks really try to drive home the idea that you shouldn't be too proud of yourself, don't think you're so great, and definitely don't think you are greater than the gods, because again, you will be punished for it in Greek myth anyway. Whew, okay, we ended perfect time. So tomorrow, come back. We'll talk a little bit about Athens and Sparta, and then I have a documentary to watch on kind of a little bit of the history of classical Athens and the history of democracy within Athens. So that should be interesting. It's got some really good visuals. Yeah, it's a really interesting documentary. So we'll dig into that, I think, tomorrow. But until then, thank you for being here. Those of you who were in the live chat, thank you for working so hard there. That was a lot of answers. That was really good. I like that. Yeah, that's it. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so have a good afternoon.